Maid's daughter rushed to Billionaire. They beat my mom. She's dying. His reaction shocked everyone. The first knock was a mistake of wind, a hollow thud swallowed by thunder. The second was a fist. The third came with a voice, thin, tearing. "Please, help!" Caleb Hayes unlatched the iron bolt and pulled the oak door against the storm. A small girl stood on the granite step, soaked to the bone, a stuffed bear clamped in her arms. Behind her, the Pacific Northwest night roared, rain slanting sideways, first bending like penitence. Her lips were blue, her eyes an impossible bright ocean. "They beat my mom," she said, the words clattering out of her. "She's dying." For a heartbeat, the mountain mansion stayed the way Caleb had paid for it to be, curated, silent, safe from the world. Then everything he'd engineered, distance, control, immaculate solitude, split along an old fault line he had never patched. He dragged the girl inside and slammed the door. "What's your name?" "Grace," she whispered, shaking so hard the bear's stitched ear rattled. "Grace Vance." Caleb crouched to her level. Gus, the ridgeback who trusted no one, already pressed to her side, instinct bending to need. "Where's your mother?" "In the cabin by the mill," she said, pointing with the bear. "Rick, he was mad. I ran." He wrapped a cashmere throw around her shoulders and pressed her small palms between his. "You did right." Then, without deciding so much as accepting the inevitability of it, he snapped, "Gus, stay!" to the security panel. "Lock down, interior release." To the girl, "You're safe here. Don't open this door for anyone but me. Understand?" She nodded, breath hitching. "Will you find her?" "Yes." He was already moving, boots, coat, headlamp, the old fear he'd never admitted flaring clean and cold in his ribs. Outside, the rain hit like shrapnel. He took the service trail at a run, mud grabbing at his ankles, the forest shivering under lightning. The staff cabin's porch light hung crooked. The door was ajar. He smelled whiskey and blood before he saw her. Eleanor Vance, face swollen, breath ragged, one hand curled in a smear of dark on the boards. "Eleanor!" He knelt, checking airway, pulse, pupils, habits of triage he hadn't used since before the money. One eye opened, glassy. "Grace?" she rasped. "She's safe," he said, and watched the word loosen something in her that pain had welded shut. Footprints cut through the mud, heavy, stumbling, recent. Rick. Caleb felt the anger arrive like a steel rod driven into frost. Not heat, not noise, just alignment. He lifted Eleanor gently and wrapped her in his coat. "I've got you," he murmured, then keyed his calm. "David, I need med team at the manor now, and find Rick Peterson." "Copy." Caleb stood, Eleanor in his arms, the storm trying and failing to push him back. The man who lived alone at the top of the mountain walked into the rain, carrying what mattered, and didn't look down, once. By the time Caleb returned to the mansion, the storm had broken into a steady, relentless rain, like the mountain itself was trying to wash the night clean. He carried Eleanor through the entry hall, her weight far too light, her breathing shallow but steady, and laid her on the linen couch near the hearth. Gus trotted beside him, whimpering softly, the great dog's instincts mirroring his own unease. "Stay with me," Caleb said quietly, pressing 2 fingers against her neck to count the beats. "You're safe now." Eleanor stirred faintly, her swollen lips forming a name. "Grace." "She's here," he said. "She's safe. Sleeping upstairs." For the first time that night, something in her face eased. The tension left her shoulders. She let go. trusting the man who had once been her employer, but now looked nothing like the cold, calculating billionaire she had worked for. Caleb had never been one for caretaking. His world revolved around algorithms and markets, things that bent when logic demanded. But here, logic was useless. So he did what he hadn't done in 20 years. He stayed. When Dr. Reynolds, his on-call physician, arrived minutes later, Caleb met him at the door. "No press, no police yet," he ordered. "I want her stabilized before anyone breathes a word of this." The doctor nodded and worked efficiently, setting up IV lines, stitching a cut above Eleanor's eyebrow. Caleb stood by the window, watching the rain strike the glass, jaw tight with silent fury. David Chun arrived next, broad-shouldered, calm, efficient, a man who had followed Caleb through corporate wars and darker ones before that. "Rick Peterson," David said, his voice measured. "Ex-Army mechanic. Dishonorable discharge, assault charges, DUIs. He's been working casual shifts at your mill since January. He's not missing. He's at the Rusty Nail, drinking." Caleb turned from the window. "How bad is she?" "She'll live," Dr. Reynolds replied. "But another few hours and she wouldn't have." Caleb exhaled slowly, a sound like the air leaving a cracked wall. "Then let's make sure he doesn't get another few hours of anything." David raised an eyebrow. "You want me to handle it?" Caleb shook his head. "No, this one's mine." An hour later, he stood outside the Rusty Nail. The bar was a low wooden shack, wedged between truck yards, its neon sign flickering in the wet dark. He could smell the sweat and beer before he pushed the door open. Conversations died mid-laugh when he entered, a billionaire among the broken. Rick Peterson sat near the back, jaw bruised, a bottle of whiskey half empty beside him. When he saw Caleb, he sneered. "What, come to fire me, boss?" "Bit late for that." Caleb's voice was quiet, even. "You hurt her." Rick leaned back, grinning through cracked teeth. "She asked for it. Thought she could take my money and run." The blow came faster than anyone saw. Caleb's hand fisted in Rick's collar, dragging him upright, glass shattering to the floor. The crowd froze. "You live on my land," Caleb said, voice cold as the storm outside. "You've eaten from my hand, and you repaid it by beating a woman and terrorizing her child." Rick tried to shove him off, but Caleb slammed him against the wall. "You're done here. You have 24 hours to leave this mountain. Touch her, come near her, breathe her name again, and I will end you." Rick spat blood, trembling. "You can't. I already have." Caleb dropped him to the floor and stepped back. "David." David appeared from the doorway, 2 men at his shoulder. "Get him out." As they hauled Rick outside into the rain, Caleb adjusted his coat, expression unreadable. "This place," he murmured, "forgets too easily what decency looks like." Then he turned and walked back into the storm, toward the only light still burning in his world. The fire had burned low when Caleb returned to the mansion. The storm had eased into mist, the kind that hung between the trees like breath after a long cry. Eleanor was resting now, an IV line running into her arm, her breathing steadier. Gus slept at her feet, ears twitching every time she shifted. Caleb poured himself a glass of water, but he didn't drink it. He just stood there, staring at the woman who had cleaned his halls for years without ever asking for anything. He had known she was quiet, efficient, invisible. He hadn't known she was broken and brave at the same time. From the landing above came the faint sound of footsteps. Bare, careful. Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, wrapped in the oversized sweater he'd given her, clutching Major Ted, the worn teddy bear. Her face was pale in the glow of the fire. "She's alive," Caleb said softly, motioning her closer. "She's going to be okay." Grace descended slowly, eyes wide. "Can I see her?" He nodded. She tiptoed to the couch, knelt beside her mother, and brushed a hand against her cheek. "Mommy," she whispered, tears spilling silently. "I found him. I told you he would help." Eleanor stirred faintly, her hand twitching before settling into her daughter's. Caleb turned away, his throat tightening in a way that surprised him. For years, he had been untouched by emotion, his world measured in market shares and mergers. But now, this tiny girl and her dying mother had dragged him back into humanity. When morning came, sunlight broke through the storm clouds, pouring across the windows like mercy. Caleb met David in the study. The security chief handed him a tablet. "He's gone," David reported. "Left town before dawn. We made sure he won't come back." Caleb scrolled through the file. Photos, background checks, a record of violence so long it made him sick. "Make sure Eleanor and Grace are never near him again," he said. "Already handled. Police report filed anonymously. Self-defense narrative locked in." Caleb nodded, setting the tablet down. His reflection in the window looked older than 42, tired but steadier somehow. "Boss," David said quietly, "you don't have to get involved this deep. You did your part." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the mist rolling through the valley below. "I told her she was safe. That means something." Later that day, he ordered the guest suite prepared, fresh sheets, warm meals, clothes for Grace. Eleanor woke briefly in the evening, confusion clouding her eyes until she saw her daughter curled up on the armchair nearby. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered hoarsely. "You don't owe us anything." Caleb sat beside her. "I don't believe in debt, only responsibility." Her eyes glistened. "I can't stay here forever." He smiled faintly. "Then stay until forever feels possible." For the first time in years, laughter flickered in her tired face. It was soft, broken, and beautiful. That night, Grace crept into the kitchen and found Caleb sitting at the long table, papers and blueprints spread around him. "You're still awake," she said, holding her bear close. He looked up. "Can't sleep?" She hesitated. "Can I sit here?" "Of course." She climbed onto the chair opposite him, swinging her feet. "Mom says you're a very busy man." He smiled. "Your mom gives me too much credit." Grace tilted her head. "Do you ever get lonely?" The question hit him like a shot through the dark. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Sometimes," he admitted finally. Grace nodded, satisfied. "You don't have to be. We're here now." He stared at her, something warm and unfamiliar tugging at the edges of his silence. "Thank you, Grace," he said quietly. Outside, the first light of dawn began to color the sky. In a house built for isolation, two souls who had lost everything had given it back to each other, without realizing it yet. 3 days later, the mountain air felt gentler, as if the storm had taken with it more than just the rain. Eleanor was recovering well, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Grace had become the heart of the mansion, her laughter echoing through halls that had once known only silence. Even Gus, the old ridgeback who trusted no one, now followed her everywhere like a shadow. Caleb watched them from the balcony one morning as Grace played fetch with Gus on the wet grass. She was wearing one of his flannel shirts as a dress, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, hair tied in a messy braid. The bear, Major Ted, sat in a lounge chair beside her, propped up like a spectator. Caleb found himself smiling before he realized it. He turned away quickly, focusing on the steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Smiling had once been a weakness, one he'd buried beneath steel and solitude, but the cracks were showing, and he wasn't sure he wanted to seal them anymore. Later that day, he walked down to check on Eleanor. She was sitting near the fireplace, a book in her lap, her arm bandaged but steady. "You look stronger," he said. She smiled faintly. "Grace has that effect on people." "So I've noticed." Eleanor hesitated. "Mr. Hayes, I still don't understand why you're doing all this. Doctors, a private nurse, the best medication. This is too much." He sat across from her, folding his hands. "Eleanor, you worked for me for years. You showed up every morning, no matter the weather. I never noticed because I didn't look. That was my mistake." "You don't owe me anything," she said softly. "I don't," he agreed. "But Grace knocked on my door. That makes it my responsibility." Eleanor blinked away tears. She shouldn't have gone alone. "She saved you," he said gently, "and maybe she saved me too." For a moment the fire crackled between them. Then quietly she whispered, "I'm afraid, Mr. Hayes, if Rick ever comes back—" "He won't." His voice was absolute. "But if he does, he won't find you alone." The next afternoon, he made good on that promise. Without Eleanor's knowledge, Caleb sent David and his security team to survey her old cabin and check on Rick's whereabouts. They discovered that Rick had tried to sell Eleanor's belongings to a pawn shop and had been bragging drunkenly about teaching her a lesson. Caleb didn't wait. He drove to the Rusty Nail again. This time, he didn't say a word. He simply placed a small envelope on the counter in front of Rick. Inside was a check for the exact amount Rick owed in debts, signed by Caleb Hayes, with 3 words scrawled beneath: "Paid in full. Leave." Rick looked at it, confusion twisting into fear. "You think money fixes everything?" he spat. "No," Caleb said quietly, "but it can make you disappear. Take the deal, or I make the problem permanent." Rick stared at him for a long moment, then snatched the envelope and stumbled out into the night. When Caleb returned home, Grace was asleep on the couch, her head resting on Gus's side. Eleanor looked up from her chair as he entered. "You found him, didn't you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted the blanket over Grace and said, "He's gone." Eleanor exhaled slowly, her eyes glistening. "Thank you." Caleb nodded once. "You don't have to thank me. Just get better." Later that night, as he stood alone in his study, he looked at the family photo on his desk. His parents, long gone. His younger brother, a Marine who never came home. He thought of Grace running through the yard, Eleanor's quiet strength, the laughter that filled the house now. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home trying to remember how to breathe again. The mountain was glowing under the spring sun, snow melting into clear rivulets that ran like veins down the slope. Life was returning to Cedar Peak, and to the man who had long believed himself beyond redemption. Caleb stood on the back terrace, watching Grace help Eleanor plant small white flowers near the edge of the garden. Grace's laughter carried on the wind. She was telling Gus that he had to guard their secret fort. The dog barked once, as if accepting the mission. Eleanor's hands were still wrapped in gauze, but she knelt in the soil with quiet determination. The sight stirred something deep in Caleb, a memory of his mother, her hands dirty from tending roses behind their farmhouse, telling him that things grow best when they're loved, not when they're owned. He hadn't understood then. He did now. That afternoon, as they all shared tea on the porch, Grace asked the question that stopped time. "Mr. Hayes," she said seriously, "are you my new dad?" Eleanor froze, cup halfway to her lips. Caleb looked at the child, blinking once, twice. Grace waited, eyes wide and full of a hope too pure to dismiss. He didn't smile. He didn't deflect. He just leaned forward and said gently, "No, Grace, but I'll always make sure you and your mom are safe." Grace thought for a moment, then nodded. "That's kind of what dads do." Eleanor looked away, tears threatening to spill. Caleb reached for his glass, throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled and fell silent. Over the next weeks, Caleb began spending less time in the city and more on the mountain. The routines of business, calls, contracts, investments, blurred into background noise. His priorities had shifted without permission. He oversaw the renovation of a small cottage in Cedar Creek, painted in pale blue, its garden filled with roses and sunflowers. When he handed Eleanor the keys, she shook her head. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You already have," he said. "It's not charity. It's a promise kept." She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "I don't want to live in someone else's kindness forever." "Then make it your own," he replied softly. "Turn it into a home." And she did. Grace named the cottage Blue Haven. She filled it with drawings, seashells, and the sound of piano lessons from an old keyboard Caleb had found in storage. Eleanor found part-time work at a local library, refusing further financial help, but she still saw Caleb often. One night, after dropping off supplies, he found Rick Peterson standing in the shadows near the edge of the property, drunk, swaying, a knife glinting in his hand. Caleb didn't hesitate. He stepped between Rick and the house, voice calm but deadly. "Walk away," Rick sneered. "You think money makes you invincible?" "No," Caleb said evenly, "but character does." For a tense second, they stood in silence, the night air humming with danger. Then David emerged from the darkness behind Rick, gun drawn but lowered. Rick turned, saw the weapon, and stumbled backward into the woods, disappearing into the black. When Caleb turned around, Eleanor was standing on the porch, pale and shaking. "You followed us?" "I promised I wouldn't," he said, stepping closer, "but I also promised no one would hurt you again." Her voice broke. "Why do you care so much?" He hesitated, then answered simply, "Because someone once saved me when they didn't have to. I've been trying to repay that debt ever since." Tears rolled down Eleanor's cheeks. She stepped forward and, for the first time, hugged him. It wasn't romantic. It was human, fragile, healing. Grace peeked from the window, whispering to her teddy bear, "See, Major Ted? I told you he's a hero." Inside, the house glowed with warmth. Outside, for the first time in years, Caleb looked up at the stars and felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Summer came quietly to the mountain, wildflowers painting the slopes, the air thick with the hum of bees. Caleb found himself spending more time outdoors than he ever had before. The mansion's sterile walls, once symbols of his control, now felt like cages he'd built for himself. One evening, he drove down to Cedar Creek unannounced. The sun was setting over Blue Haven, the little cottage glowing gold through the open curtains. From the front porch, came the sound of Grace's laughter and the clinking of dishes. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, just listening. When Eleanor noticed him through the window, she smiled faintly and came outside. "You could knock, you know," she teased. He smiled back. "Didn't want to interrupt dinner." "You already did." She leaned on the porch railing. "Grace made soup. She insists it's her thank you recipe." He raised a brow. "Does it involve peanut butter again?" Eleanor laughed softly. "A lot of peanut butter?" They stood in silence for a moment, watching the valley fade into twilight. Caleb spoke first. "Rick's gone. Arrested last week in Oregon for theft and assault. He won't bother you again." Eleanor exhaled, relief mixing with disbelief. "It's really over, then?" "It's over," he confirmed. For a long time, neither of them moved. The cicadas filled the quiet. Then, from inside, Grace's voice rang out. "Mr. Hayes, you're just in time for dessert." Eleanor chuckled and turned toward the door. "You've been claimed." Inside, the cottage smelled of cinnamon and melted sugar. Grace stood proudly at the table, presenting a tray of cookies, burnt at the edges, but offered with the confidence of a master chef. "I made them all by myself." Caleb picked one up, pretending to examine it seriously. "This looks like advanced engineering." "It's chocolate engineering," Grace said. "Try it." He bit into the cookie and winced. "Perfect," he said quickly. Grace grinned, unconvinced but pleased. Eleanor shook her head. "You don't have to lie to her, you know." "Not lying," Caleb said, "just encouraging innovation." Grace laughed so hard she nearly dropped the tray, and in that moment, burnt cookies, laughter, warmth, Caleb realized that happiness wasn't some distant summit to climb. It was right here, messy and small and perfect. Over the next few weeks, his visits became more frequent. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes books for Grace, sometimes nothing at all. He just came to sit on the porch, to talk, to be. But the townspeople began to notice. Whispers spread, the reclusive billionaire spending time with his maid and her daughter. Rumors twisted kindness into scandal, generosity into obsession. One morning, a glossy magazine ran a headline, "Billionaire Savior or Secret Scandal? The Hayes Mystery." Caleb's board of directors called an emergency meeting. The PR team urged him to issue a statement, distance himself from the family. He listened in silence, the same way he had listened to markets collapse and empires burn. When they finished, he said only, "If you think protecting them is bad for business, then I'm in the wrong business." He turned off the call, shut his laptop, and drove straight to Blue Haven. Eleanor was in the garden pulling weeds, while Grace chased butterflies with Gus. She looked up when she saw his car. "Bad day at work?" "The usual," he said. "Rumors?" "Plenty." She smiled faintly. "Do you care?" He thought about that for a long moment before shaking his head. Not anymore. That night, they all ate dinner under a canopy of string lights Caleb had quietly installed while she was at work. Grace fell asleep on the porch swing halfway through dessert. Eleanor watched him carry the little girl inside and tuck her under a blanket. "You're getting good at this," she whispered. He smiled down at Grace. "I've had the best teacher." When he looked back up, Eleanor's eyes met his, and for the first time there was no distance between them, only understanding. In that quiet, starlit night, two people who had once lived on opposite sides of the world finally stood in the same light. The first leaves of autumn began to fall across the mountain like slow-moving embers. The air grew cooler, sharper, and in the long shadows of the forest, Caleb Hayes realized something had shifted permanently. The house that once symbolized solitude now carried the echo of Grace's laughter and the quiet hum of Eleanor's voice reading aloud from the porch. But beyond those walls, the world was not silent. The story had reached the city. Media vans parked outside his corporate headquarters, reporters shouting questions about the maid and her daughter, tabloids twisting compassion into conspiracy. Investors whispered. Board members panicked. At the quarterly board meeting, the tension was suffocating. The head of public relations stood at the end of the long mahogany table, her voice cautious but firm. Mr. Hayes, your relationship with the Peterson family has created complications for the company's image. We've received pressure from several partners to clarify your involvement. Caleb sat at the center of the table, hands clasped, eyes calm. Clarify, he said evenly. You mean deny? She hesitated. It might help ease public concern. He leaned back. Concern about what, exactly? That I housed a woman who was beaten half to death? That I gave her child a safe place to sleep? A few board members exchanged nervous looks. One of them, a man named Lewis, cleared his throat. Caleb, you've always been meticulous about boundaries. This situation makes you look human. Caleb cut in. Silence. Lewis swallowed. Unstable. That word hung in the air like a verdict. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked around the table. The same men who had praised him for his ruthlessness, his control, his logic, now recoiling from his decency as though it were a flaw. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. Gentlemen, when my father built this company, he told me something I never forgot. A man's worth isn't in the walls he builds. It's in the hands he holds up when someone's drowning. He looked directly at Lewis. You can call that unstable if it helps you sleep, but I'm done building walls. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside was a document, his resignation. Gasps filled the room. Caleb, it's been 15 years, he said quietly. You'll manage without me. And with that, he walked out. No guards, no entourage, no hesitation. Just a man leaving behind the empire he no longer believed in. That evening, he drove back to Blue Haven. Eleanor was waiting on the porch, sensing something had changed the moment she saw him. You did it, she said softly. He nodded. I left. She blinked, stunned. Everything? He smiled faintly. It turns out everything isn't worth much when it costs you yourself. Grace came running out, clutching her bear. You're staying for dinner, right? He crouched to meet her eyes. If your mom will let me? Eleanor hesitated for only a second before nodding. I think we can make room. That night, after Grace fell asleep, Eleanor joined him outside beneath the maple tree. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and said quietly, You gave up a whole kingdom for us. Caleb looked at her, the firelight flickering across his face. It wasn't a kingdom, it was a cage. Eleanor smiled sadly. You saved us, Caleb. He shook his head. You're wrong. Grace saved me. You taught me how to stay saved. For a long moment, they just sat together, listening to the night. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the house. Soft, free, real. Caleb took a slow breath, feeling something settle inside him, something that had been restless for years. Peace didn't roar. it whispered, and tonight he could finally hear it. Winter returned quietly to the mountain, this time without storms, only soft snow that blanketed Blue Haven in white and silence. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the windows glowed with the warmth of a life that no longer felt borrowed. Caleb had traded boardrooms for woodshops. His mornings began not with conference calls, but with the steady rhythm of carving cedar and pine into small shapes, bird houses, toys, and benches that he donated to the local orphanage. He said it was therapy, but Grace called it hero training. Eleanor had gone back to work at the library. She came home each evening with a thin layer of snow on her coat and the scent of old books clinging to her hair. Grace, now 12, had taken up piano lessons and was determined to teach Gus to howl in tune with her scales. The dog tried valiantly. On Christmas Eve, the three of them gathered in the living room, a modest tree in the corner, lights twinkling. Grace placed a small wrapped box in Caleb's lap. "Open it," she said eagerly. Inside was a wooden carving, a small mountain cabin with two figures and a dog standing beside it. The base was engraved in shaky handwriting, "Home isn't built with money." Caleb stared at it for a long moment before his throat tightened. "You made this?" "With Mom's help," Grace said proudly. "I wanted you to remember." He smiled, his voice low. "I won't forget." Eleanor watched the exchange, her eyes soft. "You know, I never thought peace would look like this," she said quietly. "What does it look like?" Caleb asked. "Like someone finally letting the world love them back," she said. Outside, snow began to fall heavier, muting the world. Grace curled up on the rug with Gus, drifting into sleep as the fire crackled low. Eleanor stood, ready to turn off the lights, but Caleb caught her wrist gently. "Stay," he said. "Just a minute longer." She did. They sat together in silence, the room glowing gold and amber. Caleb looked at her, at the woman who had walked into his life through pain and left it filled with meaning. "You once said you didn't want to live in someone else's kindness," he murmured. "You didn't. You made it your own." Eleanor smiled, tears glimmering. "And you stopped living alone in your guilt." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the same thing." When she leaned her head against his shoulder, it wasn't a confession, just understanding. Two people who had survived the storm and built something quiet and true from the wreckage. The clock struck midnight. Outside, the forest glowed silver in the moonlight. Caleb closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past finally dissolve. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, as all days did, but for now there was warmth, safety, and the soft breathing of a child who had once braved the storm to save her mother, and unknowingly saved him too. He whispered to the quiet room, "Thank you, Grace." The fire popped softly in reply, and for the first time in a decade, Caleb Hayes felt whole.